Hello and welcome to Human. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see so many of you here. My name's Sophie. I'm a fourth year student at Collingwood. I study natural sciences. It's my pleasure to be able to welcome you on behalf of the Christian Union to our second Human Lunchtime. So thank you for coming. Human is a week of events where we are discussing questions of life, of faith, and of humanity, what makes us human. It's really great to have you here, and we would love you to join in that discussion with us this lunchtime. I'm going to invite up Pete, who is our speaker for today, if you want to come up. Just a couple of notices while we're sitting. There are loos at the back. If you go sort of out the door in the far corner of the marquee and turn right, there are loos if you need those. Also, if there's a fire, we hope there isn't a fire, but if there is a fire, please just go out. There are doors in either side of the cafe, either side of the back of the marquee, or a door to my left here. Just go outside there and then follow the stewards. But yeah, for the moment, Pete, thank you so much for being with us. It was great to have you yesterday. You're obviously not a university student anymore, but thank you for coming and spending the week with us. I've been thinking this morning about university and degrees, and I have a question. I'm just interested in how many different departments people have studied modules in during their degree. So, Pete, could you tell us, what did you study? How many different subjects did you do?
So I studied geography. I was saying to you yesterday, I think you can divide the world into geographers and wannabe geographers. I was a geographer, and I did a unit also in computer science, so 2.
Okay. 2 subjects for Pete. I'd love to do a poll of the room. So do you want to raise your hand if, like Pete, you've studied more than one subject while you're at university? Okay, quite a lot for 2. Good going, Durham. Keep them raised for 3. Still at, 4 subjects. Anyone on 5 subjects? Am I the only person with my hand in the air? Right, I've studied 6 subjects in my 4 years at Durham, so come ask me about that later if you're interested in how I've managed to do that. I don't quite know either. For the moment, I'm going to hand over to Pete, who's going to be talking to us about the question of the Bible. You've seen it as you come in. He's going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a time of Q&A. There's a phone number on the screen behind, so please, during the talk, we would love to involve you guys. So if you have any questions, any thoughts during the talk, please do text them in, and then when we break, we'll move into a time of Q&A and pitch some of those to Pete. We're going to finish at about 10 to 2, so you guys can get away for lectures, and then we'll have some more questions after that. But for the moment, 20 minutes, over to you, Pete.
Great. Thanks, Sophie. I've got to say, Sophie's commitment to getting her number 6 has taken her to Stockton. So that really is commitment to the cause, isn't it? To rack up the departments. Well, this week's premise, Human, is that we all want to live in a way which enriches our humanity and which leads to human flourishing. That's the basis of what we're doing this week. And this week, the Christian Union put on this series of events because they're wanting to put out there the idea that Jesus is essential to achieving both of these goals, that life with Jesus is both existentially satisfying but also rationally credible. And we're digging into the second of those contentions this lunchtime. I guess it's pretty familiar, isn't it, that some hold that in order to subscribe to the Christian story, you have to switch off your brain. And so there's the idea that you become less than human if you become a Christian because you have to surrender your rationality. And the thought is that that's particularly seen in the way that Christians relate to the Bible. The thought is that if you are a Christian, you can't think anymore when it comes to the Bible, however primitive or unreasonable the Bible's views may be. Einstein put it like this: the Bible is a collection of honorable but ultimately primitive legends which are nevertheless pretty childish. Or more succinctly, the great actor Sir Ian McKellen said, "I've always thought that the Bible should have a disclaimer in the front saying this is fiction." What's he saying? The Bible is nothing more than ultimately a fairy story, just like Lord of the Rings, perhaps just with fewer elves. Now, it's not normally wise to back yourself, is it, when Einstein and Gandalf are the opponents that you have. But I really do want to claim that it's possible to be an intellectually fulfilled Christian. In fact, more than that, I want to say that I believe a view of life shaped by the Bible leads to a more rational and a more authentic engagement with the world. Nevertheless, I realize that there are all sorts of objections, a swathe of them, that are thrown at the Bible, and which, to some extent, I need to deal with today. What are these objections? Well, there are the objections of what we might call worldview, the objections of science. We think, okay, people believed in miracles once upon a time, but we know better. Or we think when it comes to questions of origin, we need more than this kind of primitive story of a talking snake. Then there are the textual objections. Doesn't the Bible continually contradict itself? And didn't the church put together the books that would actually be in the Bible hundreds of years later according to its own agenda? Perhaps most seriously, I think, are what we might call the moral objections. You find some appalling things in the Bible: genocide, rape, slavery. And doesn't a part of you want to go, what kind of holy book seems to contain that? We might even add, God doesn't seem very nice a lot of the time either. And there might be all sorts of other objections that you want to bring toward the Bible today. I've got to say, when I was first beginning to put this material together, I was tempted to try and go through these objections one by one, but I soon realized that that would be very frustrating, not just for you, but for me, because I couldn't give much more than a slogan answer. So what I'm hoping to do instead is to state a case for how a thinking person really can believe in the Bible, take the Bible seriously, and then hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions afterwards, both in the formal Q&A, but also if you don't have to rush off to a lecture, in conversation together afterwards. What I want to do, though, is to start with an exploration of what the Bible actually is, because I think this is where a whole range of misunderstandings root. Now, given we're in the University of McGonagall's classroom, and where you can study, famously, Harry Potter and the Age of Illusion, I think, and given actually that the Bible is about the same length as the Harry Potter books, if you will add them together, I think it might be fruitful to compare and contrast the Bible with the Harry Potter series. There is more in common than you think. Firstly, the Bible and the Harry Potter series are both ultimately sprawling, capacious, unfolding stories. We all know, don't we, that Harry Potter is a story, but I guess there'll be a few people here who are surprised to find that the Bible is ultimately a story too. There are differences. Harry Potter, of course, is fiction. You don't see even the Harry Potter Society putting on an event like this, looking at the evidence for the historical Hogwarts. The Bible, however, is a story. It's not fiction. It's a story. It's a big, sprawling narrative. And when I use the word story here, I'm not suggesting that it's fictional, but I am saying that it has a narrative structure to it. Now, given the Bible's length, as I say, about as long as the Harry Potter series, it's not surprising that, like in Harry Potter, there are all sorts of twists and turns and different characters and subplots and surprises. There is tension and resolution in the Bible, not only in the big story, but also in the little stories and in the individual books that make up the Bible. Harry Potter and the Bible both stretch over time. Harry Potter mainly over 7 years, the Bible over millennia. And so both in the Bible and in the Harry Potter series, sometimes things happen at one point that are only explained much later. On other occasions, the author is essentially imagining that you've already read some of the backstory. I've got to say, that's one of the reasons why both Harry Potter and the Bible warrant multiple readings. Because as you read them, you spot all of these beautiful connections that you just not noticed before. Now, of course, beyond the different claims to historicity, there are big differences between the Bible and Harry Potter. There was one author to the Harry Potter series, J.K. Rowling. But the Bible has at least 40 different authors who wrote hundreds of years apart. That means that the personalities and the historical situations of the Bible writers shine through. And there's another big difference, that whilst Harry Potter comprises essentially just one genre, one form of writing, the Bible includes many different genres, many forms of writing, some that we're used to reading within our culture, but also some that we're not very used to reading within our culture. I've got to say that if you're new to the Bible, that can be one of the challenges, reading genres that we're just not very used to today. But I'd say one of the things that's helped me in all of this is to understand that different genres are able to speak into and describe different aspects of the human experience. The fantasy novel allows J.K. Rowling to address certain parts of the human experience: friendship, family, loyalty, the nature of good and evil. And those themes are important to the writers of the Bible as well, which is why bits of the Bible don't sound unlike Harry Potter. But the Bible also includes letters and law and biography and proverbs. There's an erotic poem celebrating sex. And this variety of genres allows the Bible to address a much wider scope of human experience, even than the Harry Potter series. But the key thing to grasp is that the Bible really is this sprawling story. A story in which each of us is described. We find that each of us has a part within the story that the Bible tells, but within which Jesus ultimately is the main actor. And so whereas the Bible really does demand a response from us, it's less, here is a list of things that you have to do, as much as, here is what Jesus has done. And that's life-changing for your life. Now, given all of that about the nature of the Bible, how can a thinking person base their life on the Bible, believe in the Bible? I want to offer 3 suggestions before we open it up for questions. Firstly, it's this: thinking people let the Bible speak for itself. I think many of us read the Bible expecting it to be a rule book. So we automatically assume that when we come to the narratives, we're to do a kind of Aesop's fable behind it. Let's work out what the moral is behind the story, which is normally do whatever the hero of the story does. And so we become understandably quite upset when we find these apparent heroic figures doing things that are the opposite of heroic, like marrying multiple people at the same time or owning slaves. But when we approach the Bible as the true story of the real world, can you see how that affects the way that you read? You're no longer thinking, oh, okay, God wants me to emulate this person, but more we think, okay, God's not necessarily condoning their actions, but showing that he is familiar with the real world. A real world, for example, where even heroes have the deepest of flaws. A world in which each of us, however great we are, needs forgiveness. I need to tread carefully here, but this principle also means that whilst God doesn't change, even the Bible's commands can't be straightforwardly applied. We've mentioned 2 heroes of modern culture already, haven't we, in Einstein and Gandalf. Let me add a third to the triumvirate, President Bartlett. Do you remember his problem with the Bible? That in the Old Testament, God says certain things that Christians take very seriously, but others that they seem to dismiss. So classically it's put that, God says in the Old Testament, don't eat shellfish, but Christians ignore that bit, but they get completely hung up on bits which are in the same chapter. And President Bartlett makes the point, doesn't this show that many Christians pick and choose which bits of the Bible they listen to? Let me say that's a possibility, but more likely is that those Christians have actually learned to read the Bible properly. Later on in the story, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that the food laws, including all of that about shellfish, don't apply anymore. They don't apply to us. That's not picking and choosing. That's hearing the Bible on its own terms. It's hearing the story properly. In fact, let me say that many of the objections that come the way of the Bible, and nearly all of the apparent contradictions, they disappear when we hear the Bible's own voice and allow it to tell its story. See, when we allow the Bible to speak on its own terms, and not just to proof text, we find that it has the most beautiful nuance when it comes to addressing the things that we really care about and hope for, some of which I hope you will taste this week. So thinking people, let the Bible speak on its own terms. Secondly, thinking people don't silence the Bible's controversy. Now, I've suggested that much of the outrage that comes the way of the Bible comes from not hearing its voice. But it's true, even when we have located bits of the Bible within its own big story, even when we've tried to understand it through the lens of its own cultural context, there are still many things, many parts of the Bible's teaching which it is really hard for our 21st century ears to hear. I should imagine if we made a list between us, we would come up with quite a long list. And as we read the Bible and as we come across the Bible's teaching on them, we're tempted to think, look, doesn't this just prove it? The Bible is out of date. The Bible is regressive. We ask, how can a thinking person possibly think that this aspect of the Bible's teaching speaks to us today? And here's the answer. A thinking person is willing to admit that each of us and the culture that's formed us might not necessarily be entirely right on absolutely everything. So when we find something that is difficult within the Bible, which offends us, we assume, I'm right, the Bible is wrong. In other words, we reject the Bible's teaching because it falls short of our own culture's preferences or values. But I wonder if you can see the problem with adopting that sort of posture. For one thing, it's actually very arrogant in the way that it evaluates other cultures, both historically, but also globally. This came home to me about 10 years ago. I was spending a stint in a country in Eastern Europe, Moldova, and a friend of mine that I'd made there called Jon had become so transfixed with the person of Jesus that he began to take the idea of following him very seriously. And it all built up to an incredibly emotional conversation that I had with him on a hot day on a bus in the capital city. And Jon told me, I can't follow Jesus because of something that I have read in the Bible, which I found offensive. Now, what did this man find so offensive? It was this. It was Jesus' teaching that we should love and forgive our enemies. And Jon told me, look, I realize that if I follow Jesus, I have to love the Russian people who that I know. I have to treat them with dignity. And as a Romanian Moldovan, Jon saw the Russians in Moldova as this oppressive relic of Soviet cultural domination. And so for him, the idea of loving Russian people was complete anathema. And so here's the thing. Jon didn't have a problem with the Bible when it comes to most of the things that we find problematic when we read the Bible. Jon didn't have a problem with, for example, the Bible's teaching on sex. And I suspect that most cultures around the world, including traditional Moldovan culture, would say that the Bible's teaching on sex is perfect common sense. Instead, a teaching that most of us would say is ethically beautiful, is humanity at its best, was the thing that prevented Jon from following Jesus. And so here's the question. Was my friend Jon right to walk away from Jesus because he found the Bible's teaching on forgiveness offensive? Answer that question very carefully, because if your answer is no, he wasn't right, recognize that if we interviewed Jon here right now and said, are these Durham students right to walk away from Jesus because of the Bible's teaching on sex, almost certainly he would give you the same answer. Now, I don't want to underemphasize how difficult it can be hearing the Bible speak on certain issues. Any of your Christian friends in the room with half a brain will read certain parts of the Bible with a lump in their throat. Sometimes it is painful to hear the Bible speak to us, especially on issues that we feel cut very close to personal issues of identity. It's certainly not very easy to live by this word in our culture. But, if the Bible really is the Word of God, if it really is the story of the God who pursues us in love to the point of death for us, doesn't that change things? Wouldn't we expect it to challenge us? Wouldn't we expect the Bible to challenge every human culture at some point? Clearly, the challenge comes at different points for different cultures. But if the Bible really is from God, wouldn't we expect the Bible to critique each culture's sensibilities at some point? Now, I'm sure we'll have some questions on that in a minute. But let's just look to where we've got to so far. Thinking people can base their life on the Bible when they let it speak for itself and when they don't airbrush out its controversy. Thirdly, thinking people base their lives on the Bible because they hear its truth claims making sense of reality. As we've said, the Bible includes lots of different genres which vary in how they make their truth claims. A love poem makes a truth claim in a different way to a piece of legal prose. And so whilst the Bible claims to be true throughout, we have to evaluate its truth claims in different ways. If you're new to reading the Bible, then a great place to start is with one of the Gospels. You'll find one. In fact, why don't just pick this up now? This week we're making Luke's Gospel, one of the 4 Gospels available. And the Gospels are a great place to start with the Bible for 2 reasons. One, because they're broadly similar to genres that we're already used to reading. And the other one is because they record the very climax of the story. The one true God fulfilling all of the promises that he'd made earlier in the story, stepping into human time and human space, not just to reveal himself, but to rescue us. And if you turn to page 1, here's how Luke opens his account. Page 1, where the big number 1 is at the bottom of the page. Here's how Luke begins. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, the patron, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Now, the memes write off the whole of the Bible as a myth or a legend. Do you notice that is clearly not what Luke thought he was writing in his bit of the Bible? The most recent scholarship dates Luke's Gospel as being written within about 40 years of Jesus, as when Luke says the eyewitnesses are still alive to go and interview. That means a couple of things. It means, for one thing, that there simply wasn't time for legend to develop. And not only that, but the gospel themselves don't read as legends. This doesn't sound like the beginning of a legend, does it? The Oxford academic C.S. Lewis became a Christian in adult life. His expertise was in ancient legends. And so let's hear what he has to say about the Gospels. I think the quote should come up. He says, "As a literary historian, I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I have read a great deal of legend, and I am quite sure that they are not the same sort of thing." Now, clearly just claiming to be truthful isn't the same thing as being truthful. But there is plenty of claim that what Luke has written for us is reliable. Read through this and you'll see that he keeps giving historical markers. This happened in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar and so on. He gives endless detail of people and places and titles. And so he gives detractors plenty of opportunities to criticize his account. But a prominent archaeologist of our age has examined Luke's references in both his Gospel and in his sequel Acts and found that he references 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without a single mistake. Indeed, on several occasions, Luke writes things which modern thinkers have thought must be made up, only later to be vindicated by archaeology. In chapter 2, for example, Luke describes how the census was organized before Jesus' birth, that families had to go and register at their place of origin. And for many years, this was just ridiculed by people. Why on earth would the Romans surrender economic prosperity by making them go and register in a town miles away from where they live? If you've read The God Delusion, you'll see that Richard Dawkins has a field day here. Until Luke was vindicated, because an edict was discovered in Egypt describing that this was exactly how the Romans conducted censuses in many of the provinces of the day. And so, here's the point. Luke is not writing a first century equivalent of the Doomsday Book, merely listing people and places. The people and places that he lists are secondary to his main purpose, which is to provide an account to the life of Jesus. Yet, if Luke even reported secondary details without error, how much more careful must he have been when it came round to the details that really mattered of Jesus' life, particularly surrounding his death and resurrection? I've got to say, many have found when they've approached the Gospels with as open a mind as they can muster, that it rings true. It's trustworthy. Now, as I mentioned before, C.S. Lewis concluded that the Gospels aren't legends. Why then, he asked, do they sound in places quite similar to stories which definitely are legends? Shouldn't we be troubled that the climax of the Bible story is a hero who's somewhat like us, who's somewhat unlike us, who dies and is resurrected and offers hope to humanity? Isn't that troublingly similar to Osiris or Baal or other stories in ancient literature, in ancient legends, who did those sorts of things? We might even add, shouldn't we be troubled that that's actually quite similar to the climax of Harry Potter as well? And so Lewis was asked, is the Bible's big story more about human psychology and our deep needs than about reality? And do you know what? That was the big stumbling block to Lewis before he converted to Christianity. Eventually, it was a conversation with another Christian, another fantasy writer, a man called J.R.R. Tolkien, the author, the creator of Gandalf, who spoke to Lewis's doubts. And Tolkien hoped Lewis to see that, do you know what? Yes, the Bible's big story does relate to what we instinctively long for. It does relate to what we instinctively hold to be true, but with one tremendous difference. As Lewis put it, and I think the quote has come up, the bit in italics. What's the difference with the Bible? It really happened. It really happened. Humanity's deepest hopes and dreams and sense is made in a story that really happened. Now, this week is all about helping you to explore that story. I'm stood here because I'm convinced that the Bible's big story makes better sense of human experience, better sense of reality. We're free not only to approach the Bible rationally, but we're free to explore the whole of life rationally as well. That the Bible story is the story that we hunger for. The Bible story is a story who tells us of a God who alone can offer what we know that we most deeply need. It tells the story of a God who loves us so much that he pursued us to the point of death for us on the cross. A God who offers us forgiveness and welcome. And I commend you with Lewis that this is worth investigating because it really happened, as Luke might put it, in the days of Tiberius Caesar. And with that, to questions, I think Sophie's going to explain how we're going to take questions together.
Thank you, Pete, for that. Thank you. Thank you guys for texting questions. I've got loads, so I'm not going to be able to get through all of them, and I apologise in advance for that. We're going to go until 10 to 2 and then break quickly and then start again for more questions after that. So, to kick us off, Pete, there's a question saying, what is the connection between the Bible and ritual, e.g. going to church or praying, and how does that support ideas of rationality?
Okay. You will not find a single command in the Bible saying, thou shalt go to church. It's not there. You can keep looking for it, it's not there. What the Bible does do, however, is it tells a big story, and this is what we've seen, that a God, who is a God of relationship, as we talked about briefly yesterday, in his love is drawing together a people to be his own, who surrender to his love, but who are also knit together in love for each other. That's the big story that the Bible tells. Okay. And therefore, if the end point of the story is a story of love, transforming human relationships, the God of love freeing us to love each other better, then the way that we kind of anticipate that end, but also look forward to that end today now, is to live in transformed relationships with each other. And therefore, if you've got a Christian friend and you notice that the way that they react to different people that they know, particularly different Christians that they know, who are nothing like them, who maybe are from different generations, and yet they seem to have a depth of relationship that just isn't very common, that is God knitting together his people in a way that the Bible says will be the ultimate reality when Jesus returns. And so part of what we're doing when we come to church is expressing the fact that we believe that reconciled to God, we're also reconciled to each other. We enjoy the beginning of those transformed relationships now. Part of what we're doing when we go to church is we're reminding ourselves of the big story, which is why in most good churches, actually, digging into a bit of the story, hearing a Bible talk, will be part of what you're doing. It helps us make sense of who we are and where we've come from and where we're going. And then the Bible also gives us certain other ways of remembering who we are in the story and where we're going. And in particular, there are two. One is baptism, which is basically a big picture which God gives to us, which says something very precious about our identity. I'm not going to go into that now, but ask your Christian friend what their baptism means to them. And the other one is taking bread and wine together. When we remember that we are so deeply knit to Jesus in his death and resurrection, it's as if we're part of the same entity. That just as the bread and wine enter my body, that's how closely knit I am to Jesus. And so I can be sure it's reinforcing deep within me this story that I belong to Jesus, that his death really is enough for me. But because he beat death, with my hands in his, I beat death too. And so I'm not going to pretend you wake up every Sunday, way, church. Let me tell you the number of times when I've gone to church grumpily, though, and I've been reminded of that big story, and I've tasted the goodness of those relationships, and it's given me what I need to pursue that story in the rest of my week and in my broader relationships.
Thank you, Pete. Hopefully that tells us a little bit about, how we would treat church today. I'd love to take a question from the floor. I'm going to do one more from the phone, and then we'll try and squeeze in one from the floor. So if you want to do that, think about what you might want to shout out. We've had a lot of questions about the Old Testament. You've focused a lot on the New Testament. But what about the Old Testament? If this is not historically accurate and didn't aim to be, how does this impact a view of the Bible as the Word of God?
I want to say it's all true, but the way that we read the Old Testament, like the way that you read any genre, any text, is that you work out what its genre is. Now, vast portions of the Old Testament do claim to be historically true. About half of it does. But there are all sorts of other genres there as well. There are songs, there are proverbs, there are poems, there are prophecies. There's this weird genre called apocalyptic, which kind of paints things in primary colors about what the world is really like underneath. The question may be asking about the creation accounts in Genesis chapters 1 to 11. What I would say to you is, if you're a thinking Christian, you are doing everything you can to work out what genre Genesis chapters 1 to 11 comprises, and you're reading it according to the conventions of that genre. Now, I can say more about that, but that will probably get us sidetracked a little more. Let me say, though, that the genre of Genesis chapters 1 to 11 doesn't seem to be quite analogous to any genre that we're very familiar with today. So it's not pure allegory, nor does it seem to be a purely historical account. It's somewhere in between. And part of the reason why those chapters are difficult to read is because thinking Christians have very reasonable conversations about the nature of that genre. But the answer is always read the Bible according to the conventions of its genre.
Thank you for that, Pete. I hope that helps. I know we've had a lot of questions on the Old Testament, so we'll pick up some of those after our break. For the moment, does anyone want to stick up a hand and come back on something or throw out another question for Pete from the floor? We've got a microphone that can come to you, so if anyone wants to do that, you're very welcome. Okay, we can get back to the phone because we do have quite a few on here. One more before we break. Could somebody reasonably base their life on a book that has plenty of contradictions?
Let's talk about the contradictions. I've said that. I think probably 99.8% of the supposed contradictions in the Bible come when you let the Bible speak for itself. So I don't know what else to say beyond that. If you genuinely think there are contradictions, come and show me, and let's have a look at them.
Okay. Pete will be around afterwards, so please do feel free to come and have a personal chat with him and pick up on things like that. One more that I'd like to do. What does the similarity of biblical stories such as Genesis to Mesopotamian myths, which are much older, say about Genesis authenticity?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? Nobody writes in a cultural vacuum. If you were to write a novel that was completely out of your head today, you would find yourself drawing upon pre-existing stories that are already out in the culture. You can't not do that, okay? We all do that. Now, what the Bible is doing partly is it's using conventions of the genre of the day to make its point. More commonly, what it's doing, though, is it is subverting its account against the myths that were already out there. And you'd see that particularly in the book of Genesis. Okay. So, and Jesus does the same, actually. Mark's going to be looking at a story tonight about a man coming home to his father. There was another story that was out there in the day of a man coming home to his father and the father giving him a good beating. What Jesus does is he retells that story, but with a dramatically different ending to subvert the very deepest cultural myths that were out there. And so the fact that, for instance, the account of the flood of Noah is similar to bits of the Epic of Gilgamesh might suggest to us two things. One, maybe there really was a flood. But the other one is, maybe the accounts of the flood in the Bible are being deliberately written to subvert some of the things that are being said about the nature of that flood that were already out there. We've said that all of us are interpreters. No experience comes with a label telling us how to interpret it. And so the Bible is giving us the author's meaning, and ultimately Christians would hold God's meaning to interpreting those events.
Thank you very much, Pete, for that. We're going to break now. I'd love to bring your attention to a few things before you go. On your seat, there'll be something which looks a bit like this. It's a card which says, "Let's stay in touch." It might be red, it might be blue. We would love it if you could just give us any feedback, any questions that you have, and please do fill that in. And particularly if you'd like, a CU member to be in touch with you, please do just jot your details down on that. There's a box by the far door at the back as you go out. Please just drop your cards in there. Any comments, we really welcome them. Whether you agreed, whether you disagreed, whether you want to talk about the lighting, that's fine. Please do. Please take away the other things that are on your chairs as well. There's copies of Luke's Gospel, which, they're a free gift from the CU. Please take those away with you. Also, there's cards for other things, so have a look at that. We've got our cafe at the back of the tent, which is going to be open until 4 p.m. So please do go over there, grab a coffee, sit and chat. You're very welcome to stay there for as long as you want to. Also there is a bookstall and place with resources, which are books. They're free to look at, free to take away. So go and grab one of the guys in the burgundy jumpers who's standing there and chat to them. And also, please do come back to more of our events this week. We've got talks every lunchtime and every evening. We would love to see you again. Otherwise, thank you for coming. We're going to break for about a minute, so if you need to get away for lectures, please do. And please, go to the back. Otherwise, I'll resume questions. Thank you. Okay, we're going to come back there. Thank you guys for staying. It's really great to have you around. Thank you to those of you who've texted in quite a few questions as well. I really appreciate that, and I'm sorry that I can't get through all of them on the stage, but do come and chat with Pete afterwards. He would love to grab a coffee with you and just talk through some things that you've got going on. I'm going to go back to start with another question on the Old Testament, which is just saying, what do you think of the God of the Old Testament having anger and appearing very different to the peaceful view of Jesus in the New Testament?
Great, it's a great question. Can everybody hear at the back? Can you hear?
We're getting nods from the back.
Yeah, good. So the question is, what are we to make of the fact that God appears to be angry in the Old Testament, but peaceful and loving in the New Testament. I can understand where that point of view comes from if you have a very superficial reading of the Old Testament and the New Testament, particularly if you have a kind of pick and choose approach to the Bible. Actually, I would want to say a couple of things. One is, Jesus claims to speak as the God of the Old Testament. And therefore, he is assuming, Jesus is incredibly provocative. He will say things that he knows how to press everybody's buttons. He was also a bit like this kind of expert of street theatre. Okay, he would do things which were provocative and magnetizing. And so very often he would do things that only God does in the Old Testament and do them in just the same way. It's like, see what I'm doing? And so at one point, for instance, he provides bread miraculously in the desert. Now, if you have read your Old Testament, there is one person who provides bread miraculously in the desert, and it is the God that we find there. So Jesus sees no contradiction between his own character and the God of the Old Testament. Frequently, Jesus refers to the Old Testament and to the character of the God of the Old Testament to explain why he is doing what he is doing. It is fair to say that the writers of the New Testament assume that, just as I suppose you wouldn't start reading Harry Potter book 6 if you were completely unfamiliar to the Harry Potter stories. Sure, you would enjoy it, and there would be bits that you would understand, but at least you would need somebody to fill you in on what has come before. And therefore, when Jesus speaks about loving enemies and bringing forgiveness, he's not doing it in some kind of namby-pamby sense of, let's all just have this big love-in. He's doing it in the background of what the Old Testament has said about what our hearts are really like, that they're full of darkness, that we end up doing some horrible things. So I'd say that. The third, and Jesus assumes that we're familiar with those sorts of things. Let me also say, the New Testament speaks more about issues of ultimate justice and judgment, way more than the Old Testament does. Way more. Now, I suppose there's a way of thinking about the character of God that says, is God loving if he speaks about issues of judgment? It's a good question to ask, isn't it? And a lot of people, I think that the God of the Bible is some kind of spiritual schizophrenic, that he wakes up, I'll be loving today, but the next day he seems to have, woken up in a bad mood. What the death of Jesus shows is two things. One is that God is completely committed to justice being done. Because he is a God of love, he is a God of justice. Which means that the evils that we see in the world today won't have the final say. Which means that the wounds that have been inflicted upon you in your life don't have the final say. But which also means that the way in which we have contributed to the hurts of the world must be accounted for as well. But that's not because God isn't loving, but because he is a God of love, he's a God of justice. The reason why I think we've struggled to comprehend this somewhat today is in a kind of liberal Western suburbia, which many of us inhabit, we haven't experienced many things that have been really, really, really wrong in our lives. You go to a part of the world in which deep wrongs have happened. Mark has spent a good deal of his time in parts of Africa where there are deep wrongs. And people instinctively know there that if God is good, if God is loving, then justice must be done. What the cross tells us, though, is not only that God ultimately will hold all evil to account, but also that in his love and mercy and what the Bible calls grace, he's found a way of both remaining fair and forgiving us. One of my favorite Bible verses says, where sin abounds, where evil abounds, grace abounds all the more. The original Greek puts it that where sin abounds, grace superabounds. And therefore, God has found a way not only of being fair ultimately in eternity, ensuring that justice is done, but that actually he longs to offer forgiveness and grace and mercy to people like you and me, which is why he entered human time and space in the person of Jesus, to pay our debt that we might be forgiven.
Thank you for that, Pete. Thanks for continuing to text things in. Again, can I say, we've got a microphone. Would you like to stick up a hand and respond to anything from the floor? We've got one right at the back. Thanks. Mary-Lise will jog down for me. Yeah, thank you for texting in a load of questions, guys. I really appreciate it. And Pete would love to have back and forth discussion. Yeah.
Hi, thanks.
Hi.
Thanks for the talk. I'm just asking, how does a thinking person, sort of with reference to secular ethics, sort of reconcile their differences with the Bible? Because obviously, I mean, the Bible will say, have a certain list of actions which say we can't do. I mean, the most common example would be like premarital sex, which obviously ethics would have no reason to say it's wrong.
Yeah. I think I want to say a couple of things. One thing is that a thinking Christian certainly doesn't think that the Bible has everything to say about absolutely everything. In fact, when Jesus is asked what the most important command is, he says it's to love the Lord your God, and he gives all sorts of dimensions, but including with all your mind. He seems to say if you're to be a follower of Jesus, you are to be passionate for truth wherever you can find it, which is why Christians were key in setting up many universities. And not Durham University, but lots of others. And actually, I noticed that even in your own university's website, you want to trace back your foundation to the Venerable Bede, who lived around here in the 7th century, who was the greatest academic of the day. And so Christians aren't saying the Bible has everything to say about absolutely everything. At the same time, what the Bible is saying is that whenever we interpret the world, we tend to do it upon certain assumptions. Okay? So whenever you make an ethical judgment, that ethical judgment doesn't leap out to you from the phenomena you observe. You have to decide how to interpret the data that you've seen. And all of us do that upon certain givens, okay, certain things which we just take to be self-evidently true. What the Bible claims to give us is the set of givens by which we can make judgments that really resonate with reality. And so there are plenty of Christians who are involved in thinking about sexual ethics, who have plenty of things to say, who are involved in the cutting edge of research, but who will also say there are givens that we need to hold about sexuality, about humanity, about a whole range of other things, the family that come into these issues, that we have to reckon with if we're to interpret the very latest cutting edge research when it comes to pursuing human flourishing as individuals and as societies. And at those points, if you're a Christian, you say, okay, I'll surrender these givens to what the Bible has to say. But as I hope you've seen me say, not in an unthinking way, but because the Bible really does describe reality in a way that resonates like nothing else. Does that help a bit?
Yeah, that's true.
A bit. Okay. We can come and talk further if I've misunderstood your question at all.
Would anyone else from the floor like to throw out a question? Yeah, thanks. If you want to come down here. Thanks, Mary-Lise.
Thanks very much for your talk, Pete. It was really interesting. So you were talking a lot about how you should let the Bible kind of tell you its own story. But how do we know that our subjective or potential? How do we know how subjective or objective our analysis of which genre a story is?
Yeah. Okay. That's great. How do we know what genre the different parts of the Bible are? I'll say God gives us two things. One, he gives us common sense. Okay, so actually probably when you were reading Luke's introduction to his account, you're not really having to struggle what sort of genre this book is, because Luke has made it really clear what kind of book it is. Many of the New Testament letters are very obviously letters. And I would say for the overwhelming majority of the Bible, common sense leads you there. The other thing that we're given, other than common sense, is each other. Now, all of us have our own subjectivity. I can't step out of my own 21st century British southern maleness, okay? As much as I would like to step out of that, I can't. However, normally the very best times of reading the Bible come not when I'm reading it myself, though personal Bible reading has its own place, but when you get together with a whole variety of different eyes, all of which have different blind spots. All of us have different blind spots, but also different observations, which enrich our reading of the Bible together. I'll give one example of where I've found this helpful in practice. Was that around 7 years ago, I went to a conference in which there were Christians from 160 different countries represented. I mean, it was the most amazing, even just people from 160 different countries in a room together is pretty amazing. But what the conference organisers did was they had the same part of the Bible read, and then there were 2 talks each day. One from somebody in the global north, so from North America, Europe, or Australia, and then another person from somebody in the global south, South America, Asia, and Africa. And do you know what? It was incredible how these different eyes brought perspectives on the biblical text that were completely congruous with each other, which dovetailed, but which I suspect neither would have seen without each other. And so we're given each other, and we have that in microcosm as we study the Bible today with other people. When you meet people from other cultures, it's brilliant to look at the Bible with them. Also, we have books, which means that people from around the world and from now we have 2,000 years of Christian thought. Particularly when we read Christians from several hundred years ago, often pull up our own cultural blinders in a way there as well. So common sense and each other is the answer.
Very much.
Do you want to say anything else on that?
So if people have different interpretations of things around the world, how do you reconcile your differences in faith?
Because when they're differences, they're not differences in... barely any Christian will insist on something that another person will say is false. It's more a question of emphasis, of shape, of colour. And that's where... It's one of the great things about Christian unions, actually, that you speak to your Christian friend in the Christian union and they will know Christians in practically every other church in Durham. And yes, those churches will emphasise different things. And yes, your Christian friend will probably say, I'm glad I go to my church because if I had to go to the church up the road, it would drive me mad. At the same time, they will appreciate that their own eyes and their own faith tradition doesn't have a monopoly on wisdom when it comes to interpreting the Bible. And actually, we're all subjective, but it seems to me that the more that you can both appreciate your subjectivity and look at texts and phenomena with other subjective people, that's how you begin to... You will never be objective. But the way that you begin to move more towards objectivity is to hear people who have different perspectives from yours that you can test alongside each other.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Pete. I'm going to take us back to the phone, just to a few
Sure.
questions we've had on a similar topic. You mentioned that the Bible is put together as a group of books that have been written by about 40 different authors. How does that fit with people claiming the whole Bible is the Word of God, and how do we interpret the different bits?
Yeah. Oh, this is one of those questions which, if you hear yesterday, you think, okay, this is the Durham difference showing itself again. All right. Christianity is what's technically known as an interface religion, not interfaith, interface religion. In other words, what it does is it brings together two entities which are categorically different from each other. Humanity in our finitude and God in his infinitude. Okay. And the fact that Christianity marries together the infinite in the finite means that there are all sorts of places where this just blows your mind, and this is one of them. All right, so how could Jesus be perfect man as well as holy God? Now, you may be able to give a simple answer to that, but the more you dig into that question, the more you think, wow, this is incredible. And there are rational things that you can say about that, but there are also things where you just think, to some extent, here, as a Christian speaking, I just want to say I'm on holy ground. I realize that I'm meeting one who is completely unlike me, all right? And this would be another one, okay? The Bible speaks of itself as being written by God the Holy Spirit. And yet he used human authors with their personalities, in their context, in their different places, to write that together. How did he do it? Now, there are whole loads of ways that we could say it's not, okay? It's not that, like the Quran, God called people out into the desert and said, dictate what I'm about to say, write this down. That's not what the Bible claims for itself. The Bible claims to be an expression of the Word of God through the lens of culture and human personality. So it's not that God picked up the hand and write this, okay, and the person writing had nothing to do. That's not what it is. Equally, when we say that the Bible is inspired by God, we're not saying it's inspired in the same way as you might walk and say, do you know what, as I look at the viaduct and the beautiful hills in the background, I feel so inspired to write something. That's not what we're saying either. Okay, now precisely how God worked through the humanity and the situations of those people to write exactly what he wanted them to write, there's mystery there. But if he's God, he sovereignly gave them their personality. He sovereignly created the circumstances in which they were writing. He sovereignly placed into their hearts what it was that for them to write, so that Jesus could say, this isn't just the word of human beings, but this is the word of God. The fact that that blows my mind, and the fact that that brings to the Bible a beauty, I think, unlike any other text, for me isn't a reason to be troubled by the Bible, but to think, wow, this really is a text like no other, which I want to let rip roar in my life, in my heart.
Thank you, Pete. As you said, yeah, this is a complicated area, but thanks for that and trying to touch on that explanation. I think we're going to draw stumps there for today. If I haven't answered your question and you'd like to come and talk to Pete, he'll be around here at the front of the marquee, so please do come and grab him. Again, the things that I said, take the things that are on your tables. If you want to fill in a response card and give that to us, please do fill one in and give it to one of the guys in the burgundy jumpers, and we'd love to hear from you. I also just want to say again, there's a cafe at the back. Sit there and grab a coffee if you want to, and there's a bookstall at the back there. I've got one book that I want to flag, which is called What Makes Us Human. It's a short book, so it's not very long, wouldn't take you long to read. If you're interested in that, it's obviously very pertinent to what we're talking about this week. It's been written by Mark, who is our speaker at the evening events. So yeah, if you'd like a copy of that, go and chat to the guys on the bookstall and do see if you can get hold of one, because we would love to give it to you as a free gift from the Christian Union. Please also take away the Luke's Gospels, and please do come back to our future events, because we would love to see you again. Thanks so much.